Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and as you can tell, I've got my tray here ready with some kitchen scraps for the worms. So I'm about to feed, and the feeding is not much different from what you normally see me feeding. Got a few banana peels in here, we've got some cabbage leaves, maybe the stem of a head of broccoli or something. It's hard to tell. In addition to those things, there's also my staple food item, which is a bunch of spent coffee grounds. So today we're going to break from the normal feeding, because in the past, or more recently I guess, I've been attempting to just feed all of these at the same time. That adds up to a lot of work, and rather than biting off so much each time, I've decided to kind of break things up a little bit. So the opportunity that I saw recently for that was a few days ago, when these two bags here, the African nightcrawlers in the VermiBag tote, and when the European nightcrawlers in the VermiBag mini got to the point where they reached their 200-day age. So on that day, when these reached their 200-day age, they became my oldest bins ever. So little bit different from any of my normal red wiggler bins reaching 200-day age, but 200 days nevertheless. So I created a short video about it, and I'll put a link to it up in the corner so you can check that one out if you're interested. But that basically means I did break from the pattern, and I did feed those two bins bags. So they were only fed a couple days ago, so today they don't need any food. Besides that, I've also got this bin over here, which is red wigglers. And this is my oldest red wiggler bin, which is now in excess of 90 days, maybe 93 days of age. And in the case of this bin too, I won't be feeding today because I've decided to kind of break from the pattern here. It's not set up like the other two trays on the lower shelf with red wigglers. It's set up a little differently. It's set up as kind of what I refer to as the terrarium effect. So I've got this bin covering it. And the whole idea is to try to encourage moisture to recirculate in the bin, and so that the moisture that tries to evaporate out of the bin eventually does stay inside and condenses and falls back down, and keeps the top surface of the material just as damp as what's underneath the surface, hopefully encouraging the worms to come up to the surface and break that down as well. So this bin is just going to be in this mode for a while, attempting to allow time for the residual food that's in there to all get broken down evenly, and then at some point we'll start thinking about setting this thing up for a horizontal migration and encouraging the worms to congregate on one side or the other of the bin so that the casting material can be harvested from the bin. And just another word about what it means to be 200 days old here within these bags, in the nightcrawler bags. In the case of the nightcrawlers that are in these two bins, the 200 days that I'm referring to actually goes back to the day that these worms were launched, when they were still cocoons. And it was at that time that these worms were actually still just emerging from their worm eggs, and they were still tiny little baby worms, and there were still kind of a small number of them. So that you can't really go apples to apples with my night crawlers. Even though we're now at day 203 or whatever, these bins are still just starting to kick in, because these worms still needed time to grow to mature size. They still needed time to get old enough to start reproducing and multiplying. So the 200 days doesn't really represent what 200 days down here in my wormery normally represents. Normally by 200 days I've got a bin that's full of castings, and I've already stopped feeding for some time. But these African nightcrawlers and the European nightcrawlers are going to continue for a little while longer, because they just need some catching up to do, because they're a little bit behind because of the fact that they started in small numbers, and the fact that they started as cocoons as opposed to starting as full worm bins. Something else that I'm going to do a little differently in that bin going forward, as I prepare for getting that bin to wind down and be finished and be ready for harvesting, is that I'm going to attempt to try to keep the material in that bin fairly damp, so that the material that's in there will not only be in the terrarium effect with the evaporation and the condensation keeping stuff moist, but I'm going to try to also go in there with my spray bottle periodically to make sure that things are nice and wet, so that all the food items can get broken down. So it's kind of a new approach that I'm trying. And in my tracking spreadsheet, we didn't look at it today, but my tracking spreadsheet as far as the next steps for that bin are concerned, I'm just referring to that as keep damp. So I'm not going to be logging that as feedings or anything like that, but I will be going in here regularly with my little spray bottle, which I use on a regular basis. I get the spray bottle out regularly now because the material in the bags tends to dry out a little bit more quickly than I'm accustomed to. The bags ventilate very nicely and keep airflow and air circulation comfortable and healthy. However, it also helps contribute to evaporation quite a bit. So to try to keep things comfortable for the worms in those bins, I've been regularly checking in and applying moisture with my spray bottle. So today, nothing up here on the top gets fed. Today we're only focusing on the two red wiggler bins down below, the two newer ones, leaving the older red wiggler bin to just remain damp and to try to wind down. And at some point in the near future, we'll set that up for a horizontal migration when I feel like the material throughout the bin has been pretty well broken down. But for now, it's just kind of in a rest period. So we'll leave that be, and let's get to feeding the two bins on the bottom shelf. Alright, so this red wiggler bin is now 76 days of age, and the last time we fed it was the same day that we fed all my bins, which was 10 days ago at this point. So I guess I'm curious to see how things are progressing after 10 days. So we're just going to slide some of this drier leafy material away off the top surface, so we can check on the previous feeding's status and make space for the next feeding going around here. I mean, right here I'm already finding some of the food from a previous feeding. This is a banana stem. And what's this? This is a peach pit. I did feed some plums and peaches recently, and I did attempt to get all the seeds out, except in the case of one. I believe I left it deliberately in the bin as a test to see how it goes. So this can be, I guess, one of our new test items here. Peach pit, to see how long it takes for the worms to eventually start breaking it down. But as of right now, it's still hard as a rock, so I don't think we're going to see much activity on that right away. So we're starting to see some worms as we make our way down. It's a pretty nice variety of different size worms. There's mature worms in here. I could see fair numbers of baby worms as well. And I'm also now starting to feel some of the food scraps from previous feedings here. This is another banana peel. I guess I'll try to pile up some of the older food scraps here to keep track of what we've found so far. But I don't think after 10 days, the majority of the food has probably been consumed. And everywhere down here around the feeding zone, we're probably going to find a ton of worms hanging out. But as we make our way down, there's still some little scraps here of clearly carrot shavings and some sort of a white material, potentially cauliflower, just based on the way it looks. So we'll add it over here to the leftovers pile. Here too, this appears to be, I think this might be the pear, just because this looks like the stem of it, and the white fleshy material around it looks like it might be some sort of a pear. There was a full pear placed into one of these bins, and I think it was this one. And just from the smell of it, it does seem like it's the smell of fermenting pear. So that's coming along pretty good, considering this was a good full-size frozen pear during the last feeding. I think it was the last feeding. Maybe it was 2 feedings ago. But after 10 days, that's the result of the worms having access to a full pear. And I don't know, I'm not sure if it were placed in here fresh as opposed to having been frozen ahead of time. I just wonder if it would have taken longer for that pear to get broken down, but the fact that it was frozen might have contributed to the fact that it made it that much easier for the worms to break it down and to consume the big majority of it. So I'm going to just start pushing these little worms off to the side here as I find them, because we need to make room for the next feeding. Maybe I'll push them off to the side just so when the fresh food goes in, since it is still a little bit frozen, we're not going to end up piling a bunch of frozen food right onto the top of the worms. So here on the side of the feeding zones too, you see, fairly large numbers of worms all hanging out. So I'm just going to push them up the sides as well, mainly for dramatic effect, because we all love to see large numbers of worms congregating in one spot. But yeah, I mean, I'll admit it would be pretty straightforward for me to just come in here, dump in the food that's been allotted to them, and call it a day. But I'll admit I do come down here into my wormery because I do get a kick out of handling these little guys when it comes time to feed them, and just marveling at their numbers. It's incredible to see how these little guys pile up around the food. So I do like to check them out when I'm in here, and you can see there's a fair number of worms hanging out in this bin. So I did not see a lot of bedding in here, and I think it might have been 2 feedings ago, possibly 3 feedings ago, that I did come in here with a fair amount of bedding to lay down underneath the food, and it does seem like there's not many, if any, signs of that remaining. So I think I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to beef up the supply of bedding in this bin a little bit before we add the food. So I'm just going to leave these little guys here for a moment while I go get the bag full of paper. I've got a whole bunch of shredded paper. So let me go grab that and I'll be right back. Alright, well, I left this go for a couple minutes, and these little guys sure do squirm around, so they've almost completely collapsed my little pit that I dug here for them. So let me back them off again a little bit, just so we can lay in some fresh bedding. And besides all of the shredded copy paper, printer paper that I've got that I'm going to lay in here, I've also got a fairly large collection developing here of reclaimed coffee filters. So every time I empty the coffee machine and reload it for the next morning, I do rinse off the coffee filter and set it aside and bring it down here after it's dry. But man, stuff is really piling up. I've got dozens and dozens of coffee filters here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a couple of those as well. Once I lay down the shredded paper here, I'm going to use a couple coffee filters to create a little bit of a platform to put the food onto. So let's begin with the shredded paper. We'll dump in a little bit on the bottom here. There's fresh bedding material for them. I've got a whole bag of this stuff. It's a whole shopping bag full of paper that had just been piling up, all kinds of paper that I had just didn't want to throw into the straight trash. I figured at some point I can compost it down, so Not long ago I sat down with my shredder and I just created a whole bunch of shredded paper to eventually throw into the worm bins. So I'm glad it's going to good use here instead of just ending up in a landfill somewhere. And that is one of my main motivations for doing this as well. As much as I like having nice compost to put in my garden every springtime, I also really appreciate the fact that the worms also help me get rid of a lot of stuff that would normally just end up in a landfill somewhere, which I think is terrible. Especially if the worms can break it down and then the stuff can end up nourishing my plants in my garden. Definitely seems like the sensible way to handle all the compostable materials from around the house, if possible. So, that's my little platform for the food that we're going to be giving them. And I guess let's throw in a little bit of grit here too. Usually I throw the grit right on top of the food, but what the heck, try a little change of pace. Maybe the grit will be seen by the worms as an appealing thing, so maybe it'll draw them to the coffee filter. Encourage them to break that down as well. So this is a pretty good sized stem here. I wonder how long it'll take for that to break down. I'm sure by the next feeding it'll be nice and soft and mushy, but right now it's such a huge hunk and it's frozen solid. I'm not going to be able to make anything of that, so I'm just going to throw it in here whole and start laying in some more food for them. A lot of green leafy stuff in here for them. I guess besides the greens, we'll give them some sweets too. A couple banana peels. And we'll save the rest for the other worm bin. So that seems like a pretty nice, generous feeding. And I usually put the bedding down underneath the food, but I always see a lot of people actually resting bedding on top of the food as well. So maybe we'll throw a little bit of the shredded paper that's here on top as well. So I don't know, for some reason, to me it seems like a bed is something that I rest on top of. So to me, when I think of bedding, to me it seems like it's, you know, meant to be on the bottom, and then I rest the food that they're getting on top of the bedding. But maybe that's just sort of a mental block that I need to break out of and start putting bedding on top of the food too and see, you know, which scenario works best. So that's kind of where we stand with today's feeding. We don't want to leave out the material that I always seem to forget, which is the coffee grounds. For some reason I always like kind of look the other way and forget to add the coffee grounds, so we'll put that on top, and that should be about half of what's in this container. So that'll be today's feeding, and it seems like a good amount. Seems like the right amount to put in about 10 days after they got their most recent feeding. And they did do a good job depleting the last batch of food that they received. And, you know, as long as we're on that topic, let's not forget to grab these old bits of food from the previous feeding that are all set aside over here, including this, was this the stem of the pear we found earlier? I don't even know if the pear is going to stay in one piece anymore. It might already just be falling apart. Well, doesn't matter. It's not going to look anything like that in another week's time when we come back in here to feed. But now I guess we'll try to treat this little peach pit as kind of our experimental item. We'll put that near the center so that we have a good chance of bumping into it again during the next feeding. And it's funny, I got this big wad of worms here. It's very different when you put your finger into a wad of worms as opposed to just a pile of compost or a pile of leaves. So as I was just probing around here, put my finger in this wad of worms, tell right away it was something different about it. So we'll go ahead and we'll cover up this feeding zone using the material from the outer edges. And what's on the outer edges is a little bit dry, I must say, but not terribly. The other worm bin that we saw up on the shelf earlier, the other bin similar to this, which is also Red Wigglers, the one with the terrarium top on it. I did actually go in there when I was adding water to the VermiBags, to the nightcrawler bags, and I did actually spray that bin down as well. Because like I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned it earlier, my strategy for that bin is going to be to let it start winding down, so no fresh feedings for that one, but also try to make sure that the moisture level is nice and cozy for the worms so that they break down all of the remaining material that's in there. So we've got a nice batch of compost that can be harvested soon, hopefully, in a short period of time. So, all right, very nice. This is what we got so far here. Let's get these guys covered up, back on the shelf. Let them get back to work, and we can proceed with the other Red Wiggler bin. Let's get that one out here next. All right, so this is the newest of my bins, actually. Red Wigglers as well. This is 62 days of age at this point, and it's not even that new, actually. It's a couple months old at this point. And you know, 62 days, I think, what did we say the previous bin was? 70 some odd days old. There's only a couple weeks difference, really, between these two bins. So we probably won't see much difference between the two. Let's start checking it out, see what we see. It does seem similar, just based on peeling back the upper surface. Because here we've got some paper that's sort of matted down, making it difficult for the worms to actually make use of it. So I'll just separate the sheets of paper from one another so that it can serve better as compost material. So the moisture level in here is comparable to the previous bin that we just fed. Now we're starting to get down to the layer where the previous feeding was. So we're starting to encounter some worms here and there. I always look forward to that point where you peel back a thin layer of vermicompost and then bam, you're presented with a massive amount of worms like we did in the previous bin. But here I'm finding that the worms are kind of more commingled into the remaining items, the remaining food items and food bits that remain from the previous feeding. So 10 days after this bin was last fed, it seems like the material has not been quite as thoroughly decimated as in the previous bin. So it's hard to say why. Maybe it's just not as great a number of worms in here. One thing I'm noticing, though, just from looking at the worms in this bin, they seem like there's just larger worms. I'm not seeing, you know, the presence of as many tiny little worms like we did in the previous bin. So I wonder if that also indicates that there's just not quite as much reproduction occurring in this bin. I have no clue, you know, I'm just making observations and throwing theories out there. Usually in the hopes of hearing feedback, you know, from people that can either confirm my theory or just say I'm blowing hot air. It is really one of the main reasons I started this channel, was so that I can really reap the benefit of the knowledge that all the other vermicomposters out there have, so I can hear what their experiences have been over time and learn from their successes and failures. So I'm always definitely interested in hearing feedback in the comments from people about, you know, just about anything. Whether it's your own vermicomposting experiences or just questions you might have for me, please don't hesitate. If anything's running through your mind while I'm working on these bins, then please enter it in the comments below so we can talk about it. What's this down here? Just larger chunks of stuff. Usually seems to be hunks of bedding, I'm noticing, so I always try to, you know, tear it apart a little bit so that it just doesn't stay as like a big hunk of cardboard or newspaper all stuck together. I want the stuff to get broken down, obviously. I want to make it easy for the worms to do so. So as I make my way through, you know, I'm doing the same as we did earlier, is just moving the massive worms up on the side. And I had thought that maybe if I encountered larger chunks of food, I could move them into a little pile like we did previously, but I'm not really noticing that that's the case here. I am seeing wads of some of the previous food items. Like I felt like I might have put my fingers through a pile of what may have been potato peels or something like that. But it wasn't really such that I can grab it and pile it up. It just sort of crumbled between my fingers as I touched it. So we might not have real solid hunks of food from the previous feeding to check out like we did in the last bin, which is yet another interesting difference between the two bins. So here too, hunk of kind of matted together newspaper or something like that, but still not such that I would consider this as really having any remaining bedding, left that's of any good use for the worms. Here too, some newspaper or some sort of paper matted together, which doesn't really lend itself. Looks like cardboard. Might actually be like the layers between the corrugation and the sheets of cardboard. So if it's already gotten to this point and the worms haven't slithered in between the layers, then I just want to kind of separate it so that the material can get more easily broken down by them more quickly. So I think we've kind of got a similar setup here. So we can proceed with laying down a fresh layer of bedding and fresh food. So let's go get that bag of paper again. Okay. I think that's comparable to what we laid down into the other bin for the most part. We'll just follow through what we did previously, is we'll just lay in a couple more of these coffee filters, since I have so many of them. I've actually considered running these through the shredder as well and making them into nice shredded paper so that it's such that I can add it to the worm bin as bedding instead of it just being a sheet of paper. Don't want to breathe in this eggshell dust. What I just added is pulverized eggshell, which is the stuff that I use as grit for the worms to help aid in their digestion. So these are obviously banana peels. So in go the sweets first, and then next come the veggies. So here too, a couple larger hunks of some sort of cauliflower, broccoli, not sure exactly what. And I think everything else remaining in the bucket or the basket is just small itsy bitsy stuff, so we'll just spread it around evenly down below. And let's continue with what we did previously. I like the way that last bin looked, so we'll do the same here. We'll cover the food with some more bedding material, like we did in the other bin. And then we'll just dump out what remains of the coffee. I think that's it. Nice. Looks like this coffee is developing some nice mold, which the worms should appreciate. Alright, like what I'm seeing here. Fresh bedding, fresh food, fresh dose of grit. I think we're in good shape. Let's get this stuff covered back up. Again, I'm going to use some of this dry stuff from the outer edge to create the covering here. It'll also give us the chance just to peek here on the outer edge. We didn't really poke down into it in the other bin like this. But yeah, look at this. More lumped together hunks of paper. it might make good sense for me at some point, maybe not now, but maybe in the next go around, to really better observe what's happening on these far edges, since I've been feeding down the middle, just to make sure that the stuff on the outer edges is getting the attention it deserves from the worms. Clearly the middle gets tons of attention because that's where the food keeps going, and hence the moisture as well, as the food thaws out from having been frozen. But I guess the downside to that is that the material on the outer edges gets a little bit neglected. And it's not because I'm attempting to neglect it, but let's just take a peek here too. It just seems to be that that's what happens. So yeah, here too, look at that, large hunks of paper, uncomposted bedding from maybe going all the way back to when the bin was originally built. So it might make good sense for me to think of a good way to tend to that during the next feeding. I'll give that some thought, and maybe one thing I could do is sort of, you know, try to upheave a lot of the material that's on these outer edges to try to get it, you know, in closer proximity to the next batch of food that they receive. And who knows, maybe I'll come in here with the squirt bottle and apply a little bit of moisture to the far edges of these bins as well, like I've been doing to the VermiBags and to that other red wiggler bin that we're not feeding right away, just to keep things cozy and comfortable for the worms. So that's about it for today. Let me start putting things away here, but that's not very interesting at this point. I'll use this as an opportunity to thank you for keeping me company, and hopefully you'll come back again next time. So don't forget, if you like the video, then please give it a thumbs up. That always means a lot to me. And also consider subscribing to become a subscriber to the channel. Maybe even hitting the notification bell so that YouTube can let you know when I've got new content coming online, so you can check it out. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for keeping me company again today, and hopefully we'll see you again back here next time. Take care. Bye now.